can tell the nation about that. Tell him what Jesus has done. Tell him that the Comforter has come, and he brought joy, great joy to my soul. Well, he took my feet out the mercy clay. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And he placed them on the rock to stay. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. You can tell the world about this. You can tell the nation about that. Tell him what Jesus has done. Tell him that the Comforter has come, and he brought joy, great joy to my soul. My Lord done just what he said. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. He healed the sick and raised the dead. Yes, he did. Yes, he did. You can tell the world about this. You can tell the nation about that. Tell him what Jesus has done. Tell him that the Comforter has come, and he brought joy, great joy to my soul. And he brought joy, great joy to my soul.
Grace and peace to you from the one who was and is to come. Amen. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge righteously. Defend the rights of the poor and destitute. What we keep discovering in our Sunday morning services is that everyone has a story to tell. We are, after all, storied people, made up of tales that speak of hurt and hope, success and failure. The reality is, of course, that not everyone is given a chance to tell his or her story. Whose story of a conflict do we get to hear? Whose version of historical reality is amplified, and at whose expense? These questions are especially relevant within contexts of social inequalities burdened by a legacy of discrimination and oppression. Who is given the right to speak and who is silenced? Whose story matters and why does it matter? The danger is always that only the stories from above are being heard. They are told from the perspective of privilege, power, and success. After all, the winners always make history. The Bible itself is a strange mixture of stories told from above and from below. There are the dominant narratives of the royal priestly establishment, but then there are also tales of the peasants and those who live outside of the protection and approval of the establishment. Our scriptures are a mix of competing narratives, and we might not always be aware of it, but it matters whose story is told and remembered. There are those narratives that revolve around power, governance, and triumph. And then there are the stories that witness to the needs, plight, and resistance of those who do not have access to basic resources and are being marginalized. And woven into these very different and competing narratives is the story of the God of the Exodus, who is committed to liberation, to establishing justice and peace. Here is a small collage of competing narratives, as highlighted by the Old Testament scholar Walter Brüggemann. Every snapshot, a pushing through the barrier of silence, taking the risk of opening communication. There's the prophet Amos, who was silenced by Amaziah, the priest at Bethel. Amos did not mince his words when exposing the systemic injustice of the northern dynasty. He announced the death of King Jeroboam and Israel's exile. But the priest Amaziah rushed to rescue the king's reputation and was given the power to ban and silence Amos. Amaziah made sure that the king's chapel remained a place of good news. And even though Amos was finally driven out, he did manage to have the final word concerning the deportation and exile of the northern establishment. His warning will have continued to linger in the minds and hearts of the royal priestly establishment. The prophet Jeremiah suffered a very similar fate when he challenged the royal house and the urban population. The oppression of widows, orphans, and strangers was to result in the desecration of the royal temple in Jerusalem. Jeremiah was opposed by the royal priests and prophets and finally brought to trial for making such a threat. What saved Jeremiah from execution was the bold intervention of some of the elders and the influence of the politically powerful family of Shaphan, who were in support of Jeremiah's subversive utterance. The drama of this trial illustrates the risks involved in speaking truth to power from below. And did Jesus himself not also weep over Jerusalem, anticipating the desecration of the city and its temple? Luke's gospel also tells us about two competing narratives, one from above and the other from below. Every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. We are once again reminded of how those in power are quick to silence any opposition. The public arena is a contested space. There are always voices committed to expose and contradict the claims of those who protect their privilege and power. But those who dare to challenge the status quo always risk persecution and even death. What is fascinating to notice is that the power structures did not always manage to silence these prophetic utterances and warnings. Amos continued to voice his dissent despite Amaziah's banishing efforts. Jeremiah survived his trial and was acquitted, and he did not withdraw afterwards, but continued his brave and uncompromising testimony against the establishment. And despite the threats to his own life, Jesus continued to speak up until he was eventually silenced by the Roman Empire in cahoots with local authorities. The competition between two very different narratives, one from above and one from below, is a fundamental aspect of both the Bible and the public arena. But there are even instances where those in power are so desperate or helpless that they secretly make contact with those considered enemies of the state. Our scriptures also witness to those moments when, to speak with Brüggemann, a renegade is given freedom to narrate an alternative world to which the establishment figures have no ready access. Egypt's Pharaoh, for example, is deeply troubled by his nightmares. While asleep, he cannot defend himself from a reality that is beyond his control. And when his own advisors and diviners cannot help him to interpret the dream, he approaches Joseph, a prisoner of the empire, but known to have prophetic gifts. And Joseph proves to be competent where Pharaoh's powers are limited. It is Joseph's capacity to access another reality that allows Pharaoh to respond to the looming crisis announced in his nightmare. This account is paralleled in the book of Daniel. Now it is King Nebuchadnezzar who is troubled by a dream. Again, the king's intelligence community is unable to interpret the nightmare. This time it is Daniel, again an outsider, who sought and summoned to offer his expertise. And Daniel, though being one of those deported and exiled Israelites, is not afraid to tell the king the hard and devastating truth of a statue with clay feet. His empire will be crushed. A prisoner of Pharaoh and an exile of the Babylonian king are given the opportunity to access and share another deeply uncomfortable reality. Their interpretations and stories are able to burst the ideological bubble of royal control. Pharaoh and king are subjected to a divine reality that eludes them. It is a truth that remains inaccessible to their power and wealth, but is revealed by those considered outsiders and strangers. Such consultations also happen in secret at times, hidden from the public. King Zedekiah, for example, questioned Jeremiah privately, asking him, "Is there any word from the Lord?" Jeremiah does not shy away from telling the king the truth about the impending destruction, but in return he also asks the king for special protection and care. Again, it is Jeremiah who is able to access another reality, which offers a very different interpretation from the royal priestly establishment. And it is never easy for those in power to acknowledge the limitations of their own truth and story. Quiet diplomacy was clearly also an aspect of prophetic ministry. We have a similar secret consultation in the Gospel of John chapter 3. This time it is Nicodemus, an influential Pharisee and Jewish leader, who asks for a private meeting with Jesus. He comes at night, seeking guidance and insight from the one considered a threat to the religious establishment. These kind of secret consultations reveal the possibility of meeting each other across the divide without having to lose one's face. It is in secret and at night that Nicodemus is able to admit and confess his own inadequacy. And it's during this conversation that Jesus confronts him with a spirit that cannot be controlled and aims at nothing less than a second birth. These are rare moments of truth-telling beyond the discernment of power. These are tender moments of vulnerability beyond the need for control. It matters who is allowed to tell his or her own story. And according to our scriptures, it is very often a matter of life and death. Transformation begins when the silence is broken. This does not only apply to the chutzpah of prophets like Amos and Jeremiah, or gifted outsiders like Joseph and Daniel. Such breaking of the silence is not only imperative when truth needs to be spoken to the powerful, but also in our everyday encounters and conversations within a highly unequal society. We just need to think about all those who are not given a chance to tell their story. What about those who struggle on a daily basis to make ends meet? Or those living disadvantaged lives and lacking access to resources to further their education? The rat race of production and consumption is merciless. Who would have had to be included in the book of untold stories? Whose silence needs to be broken? The victims of sexual abuse within the church, the illegal miners of Stillfontein who died underground in order to avoid prosecution, the estimated 4 out of 10 grade 1 pupils who drop out of school before reaching matric. All these stories would remain unheard would it not be for the advocacy work of NGOs or investigative journalists. Should faith communities not also be the space where dominant narratives are questioned and the voices from below are heard and given a chance to tell their version of reality? What were the untold stories in Jesus' time that needed to be heard and taken more seriously? Jesus' response to John the Baptist is telling. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me. Jesus was determined to break the silence of their suffering and exclusion. But this ministry of presence also included the women who had to find the courage to break free from the shackles of patriarchy, and the children who had no rights and were the most vulnerable members of society. Those considered nobodies were affirmed as somebody, whose story matters and whose voice needed to be heard. Their lives, their needs, and their hopes had to be taken seriously. Jesus did not wait for them to come, but sought them out. He made a deliberate effort to find them, to restore their dignity and bring healing to their lives. Such healing was not limited to their physical needs, but also addressed their social exclusion, which was often the result of their illness, disability, gender, or social status. And Jesus also did not just speak on their behalf, but helped them to find their own voice and tell their own story. This is well illustrated in the familiar story of the Samaritan woman at the well in John's Gospel, chapter 4. But for the silence to speak, there needs to be the kind of silence that enables genuine listening. Without listening, our words lose their meaning. The priest, academic and spiritual writer Henry Nouwen was deeply aware of this when he noted, "Somewhere we know that without silence, words lose their meaning, that without listening, speaking no longer heals, that without distance, closeness cannot cure." The Samaritan woman at the well encounters a Jesus who knows how to inhabit and read the silences within a conversation. These silences allow his words to not lose meaning and preserve the power to heal. And as the conversation unfolds, he maintains the kind of distance that expresses respect and resists judgment or the abuse of power. She who offers fresh water from a well discovers her deeper thirst for fullness of life that Jesus' living water promises. Jesus responds to her act of kindness with a presence that allows her to make herself vulnerable and better understand her own thirst and longing. She suffered an unusual fate. 5 times she lost her husband. We don't know if it was because of death or divorce, but it reveals the oppressive constraints of a patriarchal system where women are forced or driven to seek protection and security within marriage. The man she's together now is not her husband, and one wonders if this is a sign of silent protest against the system that left widows and divorcees in a precarious and vulnerable situation. Jesus comments on her fate without judgment or insinuations of sexual promiscuity. His words do not intend to shame or humiliate her. They rather come from a place of deep compassion. When she returns to the village, she breaks her silence and shouts, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did." She felt truly seen and known, and it liberated her to openly speak truth to the shackles of patriarchy. Note how the disciples were surprised, possibly even shocked, to find Jesus in an intimate conversation with a woman. In Jesus' times, a woman's life was confined to the private family sphere. She was rarely to be seen outside her home, and it was prohibited from conversing with men. But Jesus challenged the status quo of women as second-class citizens who were barred from all participation in Jewish learning. They were excluded from participation in synagogue worship, restricted to a spectator role, and forbidden to enter the temple beyond the court of women. But Jesus, the rabbi, challenged such discrimination. He broke down patriarchal hierarchies and divisions. He talked openly with women, offering his teaching always to both men and women and calling both of them to become disciples. The Samaritan woman becomes the first to share her experience of Jesus with the people of her village. The whole story culminates in what it means to worship God in spirit and truth. Does such truth not also include the stories of those who are usually silenced? Silence and presence, distance and listening create a space within which words do not lose their meaning but inspire healing. In such an exchange, both sides are gifted. The one receives fresh water from a well, in the other a deeper and greater thirst for life. In Jesus we encounter someone who is not self-sufficient but vulnerable, reaching out, expectant and trusting that those silenced have something to offer. And as they speak their need and hope, they discover a greater thirst, a deeper longing to belong more fully to themselves, to this world, and to God. To what extent do faith communities have to be careful not to participate in the dominant top-down practice of care, which seldomly breaks the silence? How do we become better to effectively give voice to those in need, living exposed and vulnerable lives? How do we create the space for the kind of honest conversations in which everyone is authorized to speak their own need and hope? Does the voice of need and hope not mark the beginning point of our biblical tradition? God's emancipation begins with the cry of pain of the enslaved at the beginning of the book of Exodus. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. It is a cry of pain and despair, helplessness and abandonment, which at that moment is not addressed to anyone. But while empire does not hear the cries of the enslaved, God proves to be the one who hears. This cry keeps reverberating throughout our biblical tradition, resurfacing whenever Israel finds itself exiled and enslaved. It is reiterated by individuals and nations through lament and complaint. Such a cry is heard from the lips of a king who loses his son in battle. Such a cry is heard in Rachel's weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted. Such a cry is heard when parents try to comfort their suffering child. Such a cry is heard when we grieve the loss of a loved one or witness the violence and destruction of war. Such a cry is present in every community that has to deal with loss, grief and hurt and disappointment. Such cry challenges and interrupts the official speech that goes from strength to strength and from success to success. And it is such anguish that compels God to pay attention and respond. The initial exodus is followed by an exodus in the plural, sustained by every generation's belief in a God who hears and responds to the cry for justice and peace. And should a faith community not be the place where such a cry is truly heard, we are summoned to not just to speak on behalf of those left behind or forgotten, but to create the space where those in need are allowed to speak with their own voice in order to be seen as real persons with their own names and histories, needs and hopes. Walter Brueggemann asks us to face some hard questions. Who is kept silent among us? Who is not permitted to speak? Who must live without narrative or notice? To wrestle with those questions is to be faithful to the life and ministry of the man from Nazareth. It is to become more sensitive and alert to both the human and non-human others who are unprotected and abandoned in their hope and need. It is about anticipating the future fullness of God's kingdom, where all are heard and empowered to find their voice, where all discover that their thirst for fullness of life is finally quenched. And so as you leave from here, summoned to break the silence, God bless you with a ministry of presence. May your words not lose meaning, but become a source of healing. Amen.